BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, it is October 24th, and this is the anniversary of the disappearance of Joan Risch, one of the true crime cases that we have not talked about in a while on this channel. And it is now 2019, and I am not a math person, but Joan Risch went missing in 1961, so I'm just guessing that that's the 58th anniversary of her disappearance. And yes, it's been 58 years, but still we are not 100% certain about what happened to Joan Risch back on that October day. Another year has come and gone, and we still don't have the definitive answers. One of the ways, though, that I was trying to get somewhat of a refresher for this case was I was checking out the YouTube channel from Bella Fiore, who's a true crime YouTuber, but I think she also does some other things. I see her name all the time in the search results, but I had never actually seen one of her uploads before, so I decided to check that out, and overall she has a pretty good presentation on it. I mean, most people often cite the Kaylee Elise presentation on the disappearance of Joan Risch from 1961. I wanted to see what someone else had to say. And the thing is, though, I thought that she stayed a little bit too close to the Wikipedia. But aside from that, though, we were covering Joan Risch quite a bit in 2017, but then, like some other cases came up, and, one of the things with the disappearance of Joan Risch, though, being as old it is, there are two big things. Number one, there aren't an enormous amount of new breaks in the case and new leads, and the second thing is, that stuff that you do find on Wikipedia isn't necessarily 100% accurate and verbatim, and over the last 58 years, some things get lost to history, some things become legend, and those were kind of some of the pieces of information that we dealt with when encountering the disappearance of Joan Risch and learning about it from people, in the comments section and kind of challenging theories, as well as listening to other things, as well as listening to other YouTubers like Bella Fiore, and the other one that I cited in the past was Sophie Unsolved, and it's like, there's a lot to say about this particular one, and if you're just jumping right in and you've never really heard anything other than the name Joan Risch before, Joan Risch went missing on October 24th, 1961, from her home in Lincoln, Massachusetts. She had been going about a normal day. Her husband, Martin Risch, was away on a business trip. Joan went to the dentist in the morning. She scheduled a follow-up appointment even, and that's very important to note during disappearances. When people are kind of going about things like that, that kind of really gives a lot of investigators the impression that someone is making plans to stay or someone is making plans to leave. And, but she did. That's what happened. She scheduled a follow-up appointment, and then she took her daughter back home, and her daughter Lillian went on sort of a kind of play date, if you will, with one of the neighbors, and then Joan was left at home with only her youngest son, who then went upstairs to take his sort of daily nap. He usually took a nap from 12 to 2, and then, well, we aren't 100% sure about everything that was going on with Joan, because in theory, she should have been the only person in the downstairs area of her house. Now, there is a sighting of Joan that afternoon by one of the neighbors, Mrs. Barker, but I was very glad that Bella Fiore was keen to point out something, that this sighting of Joan actually kind of happened from a very large distance, but the thing that Bella Fiore was saying is that it was an obstructed view, and this is just something that I learned, discussing this with someone named Carla, who used to post frequently on the Joan Risch uploads, and we had a lot of conversations about this, and the view was obstructed, but she said that she saw Joan Risch walking with outstretched arms and carrying something red. Now, kind of got to give a little bit of a spoiler. Joan Risch disappears and she goes missing, and eventually there's going to be a lot of blood in the kitchen. So many people would interpret this to be her hands were bleeding, or like that she had blood on her hands from a bodily injury. Other people have interpreted this to that maybe she had an abortion and she's actually holding the fetus. Yeah, I don't think so. And then there's the third thing that people have said, which is just very simply that how on earth could someone make out all of those details when they're looking at something through an obstructed view from more than 100 feet? It might have even been as much as 100 yards or something. I forget that exact specific, but it's a very large distance from the Barker house to the Risch house in that particular area, that is. And this actually, like, even kind of brought up the possibility, was Mrs. Barker fabricating the sighting? Or one thing that I had entertained in the past was, while she was talking to investigators, were they encouraging her to say certain things? Or was somebody encouraging her to say certain things, kind of like leading questions? Because it's very odd that people kind of recall specific details when they aren't looking for them, especially at such a large distance with an obstructed view. I'm kind of like, I've always been curious about that final sighting. There also was a report that there was a sort of two-toned car in the Risch driveway in, like, earlier on in the afternoon. And this will be a kind of important for a few theories that are going to come up later on. Now, the big moment. Joan goes missing. Joan's daughter Lillian returns from the play date and she comes home. Then she goes back to the Barker house and says somebody has smeared red paint all over the kitchen. They go there, and of course there is no sign of Joan, and blood is all over the kitchen. And it appears that someone tried to clean it up with a pair of the baby's overalls, and that, of course, is talking about Joan's son, who was upstairs, and his diaper needed to be changed. And, of course, Mrs. Barker aided with that. But the thing is, though, I mean, this has just kind of left people in an enormous amount of, like, just suspicion, and just an enormous amount of confusion, rather, about what on earth happened to Joan. The phone had been pulled out of the wall and was in the wastebasket, or the bin, rather, that had been moved to the center of the kitchen. The receiver of the phone was kind of hanging on the edge of the trash can, and a phone book was open to the emergency numbers. Bella Fiore provided an interesting statement when she was saying that this wasn't actually a traditional phone book, that this was something that was kind of like an address book where people would manually write down phone numbers. It's the first time I've ever heard that one before. Either that or maybe I just overlooked it. I mean, it's not the biggest detail in the world. It's just the emergency numbers were open, but I don't know. I just thought I would mention that particular thing. Aside from that, though, the giant mystery is, what happened to Joan? Where did she go? And was someone involved with her disappearance? And when I said, though, that the Wikipedia wasn't very helpful with the kind of facts and information, the first time I ever found out about the disappearance of Joan Risch was Wikipedia, and I stated that this was one of the first cases that I ever learned about solely because of Wikipedia's related articles. I mean, like, I learned about the disappearance of Beverly Potts and the murder of Marcia King and Annika Ersberg, the stolen meat murders. Like, we learned about those things because just Wikipedia gives you those related article suggestions. And one of the first ones I did learn about was the disappearance of Joan Risch, and those are all cases we've covered on this channel, by the way. So it's like, when we saw something like that, I mean, they didn't really seem to mention that there was sort of a set of unidentified fingerprints found in blood in the Risch household. I was always skeptical of that. And when I first heard the Kaylee Elise presentation, and she was saying that there were two sets of fingerprints going on, I was just like, wait a second, no. I mean, like, it doesn't sound like that's what was happening. What it said on the Wikipedia was that it's just that Joan wasn't there to give a fingerprint sample, so they weren't able to match the fingerprints to anyone. Meaning, yes, they're unidentified, but they never compared them to Joan's fingerprints. So it's like, they just don't know whose those are. Joan wasn't there to give a sample. I was like, why didn't they go to her hairbrush or something? And apparently maybe that's just not possible, because they couldn't guarantee that those would be hers in terms of forensics. But once again, though, someone left a kind of packet of documents on one of the previous Joan Risch uploads that I did on this channel, and supposedly that says that this, yes indeed, that was not Joan's fingerprints. I'm kind of like on the fence now, or maybe this isn't like the biggest mountain to make when it comes to the case, but there is just something to always bear in mind, that, once again, you're just getting conflicting information from conflicting sources. And the only reason why I'm mentioning Wikipedia is, first and foremost, that's how I learned about the case in the first place. And secondarily, an enormous amount of people are reading it. Maybe beyond any of the sources on YouTube, people are probably going to start with the Wikipedia as one of the primary tools that they're going to be using to research this. So I just wanted to mention that. The second thing is this mysterious car that was parked in the in the Risch's driveway. I was going to say the Joan Risch driveway, but the Risch house driveway. The police insisted that this was not anything other than their own cruiser. that the first police car to arrive on the scene was this two-tone car that seemed kind of out of place to certain people. And I say that because when Mrs. Barker called the police, they arrived within 5 minutes, and they're like, no, the witnesses just got the time wrong. The witnesses were just mistaken about when they saw this car. They're like, the car that they were talking about belonged to the police. The witnesses are just wrong. It sounds really weird. And when you say it just like that, people are like, what on earth are you talking about? And this has prompted many people to actually believe that Joan Risch was having an affair with a policeman, trying to say that this could be one of the motivations for the disappearance. When I was watching that Bella Fiore upload, she was sort of talking about how it seemed rather unlikely to her that Joan Risch would have had an affair with another man and become pregnant by another man, and that the blood you're seeing in the kitchen is actually the result of a sort of abortion or miscarriage that had gone wrong from from the kind of man that Joan had become pregnant with another man that was not Martin Risch, and that she had an abortion or a miscarriage in the house, and that's what kind of prompted the sort of like giant messy scene that you saw. Like the giant mess that you see there is actually the result of all that. And they're thinking that the person she could have been having an affair with was a policeman. It's just a theory. I mean, I don't think there's that much to corroborate that. Just that this police timeline just seems rather bizarre. It does seem like a little bit of a cover-up. But once again, though, I mean, I don't necessarily know if that's the biggest detail in the case, because there is a giant... there's just like a much bigger piece of information to discuss, and that would be the fact that multiple people say they saw a woman matching Joan's description walking along roads near Lincoln, Massachusetts, and I believe this is actually down the median of a highway. It seemed like she was clutching something red, and that blood was running down her legs. And one of the biggest comments that I see on all of the Joan Risch uploads on YouTube is that people are just like, why didn't anyone stop to help? Why didn't anyone stop to help this woman who had blood all over her? They just drove on by. And when we did the upload on the case of Cynthia Jaramillo, she was the woman who escaped the serial killer David Parker Ray in New Mexico. And she kind of like was able to escape, but she was completely naked, only wearing a chain around her neck. And she just kind of just was running and trying to wave down cars, and people just drove on by. And I was like, once again, you see someone naked with a chain around their neck, and they're like, you're just like, meh, gotta keep going. And it's almost a similar thing with the disappearance of Joan Risch, but that type of behavior is not uncommon, and it's not unheard of, I should say. When people see somebody in a very bizarre circumstance where they look like they desperately need help, and then people are just running on by, those things do happen. So, I mean, some people have just sort of thought that Joan either had a miscarriage, or maybe she even was kind of going through an abortion that was illegal at the time. Remember, abortion wasn't illegal until the 1970s. What was it, Roe v. Wade, 1973 or something like that? And it would have been illegal. So they think that Joan might have just been experiencing some severe disorientation after having even a miscarriage, and that she walked out of the house because she thought that she was too disoriented to drive. She grabbed her light coat, not the heavy coat that she wore to the dentist earlier that day, her light coat from the closet. She checked on her baby one more time, and there are droplets of blood in all these areas. Then she walks to the garage, then thinking that she can drive. Then she decides, no, I can't drive. And then she walks out, and then in her own disoriented state, she either fell into a construction pit, fell into some other sort of location that would have caused her death, and that's what led to the death of Joan Risch, and that's kind of the mystery. Okay, so that's kind of like abortion theory, disorientation, as well as, something else that possibly could have been the victim of an assault, something that would have caused Joan Risch to be very disoriented, and she passed away in an accident. Alright, that's one thing. Then, though, a journalist was researching the case and decided to kind of go to the library in Lincoln, Massachusetts, to kind of read up on disappearances. And so the legend would have it, once again, mind you, 58 years, a lot gets kind of changed. It's like a game of telephone or Chinese whisperers where the details really begin to change, but the legend would have it that this journalist goes to the library to read up on missing persons cases and disappearances, and she picks up a book on it. And then she saw that Joan Risch had checked it out in the past. She picked up another book on missing persons cases and disappearances, and then she sees, oh, well, Joan Risch has also checked out this book. Now, this is kind of the sort of an explosion into the giant possibility that what if Joan staged the disappearance? What if she inflicted a wound on herself and kind of allowed herself to kind of bleed out on the kitchen floor and then smear things around and intentionally placed the items in a bizarre way? We did about 6 uploads on the disappearance of Joan Risch, and then I finally put out one called The Disappearance of Joan Risch Conclusion, where I was just like, now wait a second. Every example you follow in this one leads to a dead end. Every example you look at, you just get lost. Part of it is because the case is very old, and once again, as we mentioned, there aren't many breakthroughs. It is a very cold case. But then I just began to think, what if these things aren't making any sense because someone has kind of made them that way? Someone has kind of intentionally distorted the evidence to make it confusing and bizarre. And one of the first things you read about this is that there was a drop of blood on kind of like the center of the trunk of Joan's car, and the police officers just couldn't make sense of it. What if the reason that they can't make sense of it is someone intentionally put it there to be confusing? And then Joan leaves, never to be seen again. Maybe she ran off with a person. Maybe someone picked her up on the side of the highway. And that was one of the things that I had thought about for the first time. What if someone did indeed stop to help her on the side of the highway, and she just got in their car and was never seen again, and they just kind of took her home? There are no reports of anyone matching her description at the hospitals, and Martin Risch, her husband, believed that she ended up with amnesia. She lost her memories and was never able to get them back. He doesn't think that this was a staged disappearance. For the longest time, I thought this was an abortion that went wrong. I thought that this was either an abortion or a miscarriage, one of those two that went wrong. And then I had a giant reversal about like after maybe putting out 6 uploads on this channel, and I was like, wait a second, what if this is indeed a staged disappearance? Someone is checking out books, including the book Into Thin Air, which gives a very similar description of the disappearance that Joan had experienced. Like, there's just blood on the floor and there are towels and someone is trying to clean it up. Very similar. And I do have to say, though, that was the absolute first instinct that I had about this case. When I read the Wikipedia article for the first time, I was like, this is fake. She did it herself. But then I began to think, now wait a second. How many of you have listened to something about true crime and a disappearance? And what if you went missing and then someone were to look at your computer history or something like that, or the YouTube search history that you've been watching or listening to? Wouldn't they see some sort of thing about true crime or a disappearance? And then you'd be like, hey, wait, what if this person went missing because of that? She liked mystery novels. She liked mystery books. She liked true crime. And as it just so happened that someone who was reading that type of stuff also went missing, it's not impossible. And one of the things that I thought Bella Fiore kind of made a very good statement was both the abortion miscarriage theory, like, that Joan had like kind of an abortion gone wrong or a hemorrhage or a miscarriage, both the abortion miscarriage theory and the staged disappearance theory make sense. And that is one of the biggest problems that we're dealing with in the disappearance of Joan Risch. Both of these possibilities make sense. And that's one of the reasons why I think that this case is very difficult to solve. However, though, we did get a comment coming in one of the later uploads that we did on the disappearance of Joan Risch that said that the blood that had been left behind at the crime scene was not only Joan's, but it came from a hemorrhage because it had been analyzed at a laboratory at Harvard University. And then they actually found kind of micro hairs from a fetus in the blood that had been kind of smeared around the kitchen. So that almost would cement the fact that it was the blood that came from Joan Risch, and it was the result of a miscarriage or an abortion. Not to mention that, but the first I should say about that, someone left that comment on one of the previous Joan Risch uploads we've done on this channel. That's the only source that I can cite for that. Another one, though, that I would state is that we did an entire upload on Joan Risch, the beer bottles that were found at the scene. There's a very famous line that Martin Risch said that he had been drinking a bottle of liquor with his wife the night prior to her disappearance, but he couldn't account for the beer bottles that were found by the investigators after Joan had disappeared. This is a very famous line. It's on the Wikipedia. It's on all of the Joan Risch disappearance literature and the videos and all of that. But Carla, the person I mentioned that I used to correspond with the case about, actually dug some things up about the investigation and found that those beer bottles were actually from a few previous nights. He just meant that they didn't drink them the night before Joan's disappearance. They had guests over a few previous nights. It's kind of a piece of misinformation that is circulated. And I had put so much stock into that particular detail because I'm like, okay, Joan has a secret. Joan has hiding something from her husband. But in reality, I mean, I was even Googling stuff. How do you do a homemade abortion using beer? And you will find some scary stuff. But, like, it makes it a lot simpler, actually. Those things have nothing to do with the case. The beer bottles were actually from a previous night in the week, and that they aren't really that connected. But it's almost just like there is a lot of things that are circulating on the internet that are not 100% accurate. And it seems like that this is what happens with older cases. Almost any time we are talking about an older true crime case that is older than 50 years old, or even 45 years old, who's counting, you will find that the mainstream understanding of the details is not 100% accurate. Once you sort of go into go a little bit deeper, you will see that it's just the actual story is quite different. And people actually put out, things that can be containing misinformation. It's just been circulating 100,000 times, but it's not always 100% accurate. It just seems to be something that we're experiencing. And we've talked about stuff even on this channel back to the 1800s. So, I was just very, very skeptical of some of the information that's on the internet regarding true crime cases. But if you're just at home and you're trying to learn about this stuff, that's sometimes your best resource. Sometime over the next year, I hope I get a chance to read the book Into Thin Air to learn more about the disappearance of Joan Risch. It is a case that we can actually solve. There is a definitive answer, though, about what happened to Joan. I mean, if you could actually say somehow that we could kind of confirm that source, that Joan's blood was analyzed by a laboratory at Harvard, and that the beer bottles have nothing to do with the disappearance, that would just sort of seem like this was either a miscarriage and someone was too disoriented to drive, so they got out. Maybe the amnesia thing is correct, or maybe this is indeed something like Joan chose to leave and go with another man, and that the police are involved, and that she was having an affair with a police officer, and that's why the police didn't put in 100% effort and kind of cover the situation up. Those things might be lost to time, though. We might not get 100% understanding, but perhaps we could get some definitive answers. Well, that's all for me now. What do you think about the disappearance of Joan Risch back in 1961? I would love to hear from you. Anything you have to say. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. And if you didn't like this upload, please also hit the like button. Nothing but love, love, love everything, love everyone. All right, now that's all for me now, and until next time.